Hey everyone, this PowerPoint video is based on analyzing propaganda through secondary sources and using the Peel framework. This will prepare you for your work in lesson 2. So let's begin. The outcome that I'll be assessing you on is your ability to discuss and evaluate differing interpretations and representations of the past. So you will be evaluating secondary sources and examining their interpretation of the propaganda posters that we looked at last lesson. What are secondary sources? I think it's important to highlight exactly what they are, even though we have touched on this before. So secondary sources are created when a historian uses primary sources to reflect on a topic. Due to the fact that secondary sources are created after an event has taken place, they can take into consideration other evidence and events and place the primary source within a historical context. Why are secondary sources created? I've included this so when you're examining secondary sources, you have some idea about the purpose of it, why it was created in the first place, and here are some reasons secondary sources are normally created. They're created to expand scholarship in an area, debate a particular topic, fill gaps in research about a topic, and to offer a new perspective on primary evidence, and to reinforce historical arguments. Thing about offering perspectives on primary evidence is that there's always new ways of looking at things, and so secondary sources like to look at primary evidence and discover new ways to think about it. Evaluating sources. So if you have a secondary source, you should ask these questions of the secondary source to evaluate whether it is credible and reliable. So let's begin. Consider who is the author. Are they a scholar in the field? Are they a historian? Have they been writing about this topic? Is your secondary source published by a scholarly publisher? So for example, is it just published by a student in high school? Is it just an essay published by a student in high school? Or is it a thesis by somebody at a university? So that makes a difference. What is the purpose of the text or motivation for writing it? Do you sense some bias in the text? Does the book or article have an extensive bibliography? Are you able to follow the author's sources? Are you able to discover where their opinion comes from? What are they basing it off of? What are the primary sources referred to by the author? Are they omitting some primary sources? Are they looking at all of the primary sources? Are they discussing very few evidence or a lot of evidence? What secondary sources are used by the author? So what other secondary sources does the author rely on? Is it just their own opinion on the primary source? Or are they also relying on the opinions of others? Does the text have citations enabling you to check the author's sources? So are they very vague in referring to other authors they've read, or have they clearly outlined exactly where you can get the information from so you can see for yourself? So all of these things make a difference, and it will help you discover whether a source is reliable and trustworthy. Moving on. Judging the usefulness of a secondary source. So we've touched on this before as well, but basically your secondary source is useful if it is helping you answer the question that you're asking. So if your question changes, the usefulness of your source will change as well. For example, a World War I British propaganda poster would be useful to a historian studying the strategies utilized by the British government to enlist men for the war. However, for a historian studying the nature of trench warfare, the propaganda poster would prove to be much less useful, if at all. However, if I were to shift my question to suit the source, then of course it will become useful to me. Here is an example of a question that you might get. It's a 5-mark question, so you'd be expected to write about a paragraph using the Peel structure, and here's how you would go about doing it. So step 1, read the source. Well, I haven't put step 1 as reading the source, but of course read the source, examine what it is, and read the question and unpack the question and highlight relevant words. For example, I've highlighted the word describe, purpose, British foreign propaganda. So these are the key words, and when I'm reading, when I'm reading the source, I will look for words such as British foreign propaganda, things like that, to help me come up with an argument when I'm answering the question. So you can use Adamant to annotate the source. So if I were to use Adamant, I would be thinking, who's the author? It's a guy named Sanders, and the date that he's written this is in 1975, so it's not very current. The audience for this, would this be other historians? Definitely people who are interested in the historical side of things. It's not just a newspaper for consumption for everyone. It's people who actively seek out historical investigations. And the message, what is it sending? Well, you'll have to read it. If we read the first paragraph together, we'll be able to uncover the message. So let's just go through that. At the outbreak of war in August 1914, the Germans poured out propaganda in the form of posters, leaflets, and pamphlets in an attempt to explain Germany's entry into the war and discredit the motives of the Allies. The British government was greatly disturbed by the virulence of the German campaign, which was specially directed towards influencing the United States of America. At the end of August 1914, the matter was raised in the cabinet. Mr. Lloyd George urged the importance of setting on foot an organization to inform and influence public opinion abroad and to confute German misstatements and sophistries. On 5th September, the cabinet decided that steps were to be taken without delay to counteract the dissemination by Germany of false news abroad. Though there had been no peacetime precedent, the cabinet accepted the need for an organization to coordinate propaganda directed at foreign opinion for the duration of the war. So, we're specifically talking about British foreign propaganda, so how is Britain seen by other countries? And we can see that the message this secondary source is trying to send us is that a key reason for British foreign propaganda was to eliminate or overcome the dissemination of false news by German propaganda and the effect it was having, especially in relation to influencing the United States of America. So that's the message. We know that's the message. What is the agenda? The agenda is simply to analyze British propaganda during the First World War and to provide an opinion on it, to say that it is in response to German propaganda. So you'd be annotating this, you'd be drawing lines around the source and writing this information down. The nature of this source, well, it's a journal article, and it's a journal article that exists in the Historical Journal, and it's printed in Great Britain. What about technique? What techniques are being used? Well, you'll see the person is referring to other sources to increase their credibility. So they're not simply providing their opinion, they're actively seeking to embed evidence in their work. So that is a technique, relying on other sources. So that's some information you could annotate the source with. And then thirdly, you use the Peel structure to answer the question above. I have an example on the next slide, so we'll move there. So this is my sample response. As you can see, I have color coded it, so you can see exactly where I have used my point for P, my evidence for E, my explanation for the other E, and my linking back sentence. Let's just read through it. According to source A, an excerpt from an article from the British Historical Journal, a leading purpose of British foreign propaganda during World War I was to counteract the effect of the German campaign and dispel German false news. This is evidenced by the source's use of a quote from the primary source Herbert Asquith to the King, 1914. Mr. Lloyd George urged the importance of setting on foot an organization to inform and influence public opinion abroad and to confute German misstatements and sophistries. The source makes it clear that a leading threat to the British war effort was the effect of German foreign propaganda that aimed to justify its entry into the war and discredit the motives of the Allies. Thus, it can be seen that an important purpose of British foreign propaganda was to counteract the effect of the German campaign and dispel German false news. As you can see in my introductory line and in my linking back line, I have basically reiterated the same judgment, and that's important. You don't want to be adding new information to the last line of your paragraph. You simply want to remind the reader what it is that you were trying to prove. Moving on, we come to the checklist. So at the end of this video, you should have a pretty good grasp of how to do the following things, and you should have these skills in order and ready to go for lesson 2. So 1, you should know what secondary sources are. You should know why secondary sources are created. You should know how to evaluate written secondary sources. You should know how to gauge the usefulness and reliability of a source. You should know how to use the Peel framework to write a paragraph response. Thanks for listening, guys. I'll see you in class tomorrow.